Good morning. Thank you for joining us today on our webinar Wednesday for March. Today, the subject we're looking at is fire risk assessment, understanding the problems, and we've had over 200 people register for this morning's webinar, so it looks set to be a popular one, hopefully with a lot of questions from you. So my name's Katie, and I look after the digital side here at CABE, so I'll be assisting with any questions that you have and moderating the webinar, and just generally looking after things and making sure it all runs okay. Your speaker today, your presenter, it's Kevin. He's our technical director here at CABE. And if you want to get in touch with us today, what you can do is either on your right-hand side or at the top of the screen, depending on how you're viewing the webinar this morning, there's a little option to actually type questions into us. So if you want to get in touch with Kevin or myself, you can just type in a question that way and it'll pop up on our screen. And what we'll do is either answer the questions as we go along, or Kevin will slot them in as he sees fit, or ultimately we can just, if we get a lot of questions on a similar subject, we can perhaps look to address those at the end. If you've got any very specific examples that you want to discuss with us, we might actually contact you separately after the event has finished. We're on Twitter, hashtag CABECPD. As I say, Kevin's looking after us this morning with the content, so without further ado, I'll hand you over and he can talk you through fire risk assessment.
Good morning, welcome to the webinar. As Katie said, today we're going to be looking at fire risk assessment. I first of all ought to put in a sort of a disclaimer. In watching this webinar, please don't expect by the end of it you'll be capable of doing a fire risk assessment if you currently don't feel that you are. But what we are going to talk about today is the sort of principles involved, some of the main key areas involved within fire risk assessment, why it's important, and the process that maybe you would go through. So I suppose the first question to ask ourselves is, what's a fire risk assessment and why are we actually doing one? And I would say that right at the outset that the main difference between the fire risk assessment and maybe the fire strategy and the fire design of the premises is that the fire risk assessment is focused on the actual use, the operation and the management of a premises, and that will include the physical features, the active and passive fire precaution measures that are built into a design. But quite often there will be aspects identified in a fire risk assessment and means of addressing some of the hazards or the risks that occur that are dealt with by processes in the workplace, by processes in public buildings, by management procedures that won't necessarily follow what we might find in a British standard or an approved document to the building regulations or something of that sort, but which actually work within the premises and create a safe situation. So the concept of the risk assessment is to have a structured, methodical review of the workplace, the activities that go on, the management procedures, identify the hazards that could potentially cause harm to people around the process, and then having identified those hazards, coming up with a framework to look at determining what risk they pose to people and how that risk can then be mitigated or reduced by additional procedures or additional precautions within the premises. Now, fire risk assessments may focus on the risk to people, as is usually required by the legal framework, but people may also choose to do a fire risk assessment of their premises to look at things like business continuity and property protection, and to look at it as part of a bigger issue. So what we first of all have to do is to identify what are the potential hazards there, and then, as I say, once we've identified the hazards, we can look at how we can reduce the risk that's involved with those hazards. So I've talked about hazard, I've talked about risk, and obviously we're talking about a risk assessment, but it's important to sort of differentiate between the potential hazard and the risk. The hazard is something that is there in the building, in the situation, that has the potential to cause an injury or to cause damage. So it might, in terms of a fire risk assessment, the hazard is something that might have the potential to cause a fire. The risk, which is what we're trying to address, is the chance of harm occurring as a result of that hazardous situation. and therefore there will be some hazards that can be identified but actually are minor in nature, highly unlikely to happen, and therefore the risk of a consequence to a person is relatively minor. And in doing the risk assessment, there will be some judgment calls to make on how severe the hazard is and how likely it is to cause a risk to the safety of the individual. So, starting from first principles, if we're going to start looking at hazards and identifying potential risks, then we need to understand the basic principles of the fire. And I'm sure all of you watching today are familiar with the fire triangle and the concept that what we need for a fire to start is a source of ignition, a source of fuel, and a source of oxygen. And if one of those three elements is missing, then it may well be that we're not going to get the fire. So if we had a particularly hazardous fuel source in a building, one of the approaches to take in a risk assessment potentially would be to look at removing the potential sources of ignition. It's far more difficult to remove oxygen from the equation usually because we need it to breathe. But if we can identify a particular hazard and therefore remove part of the triangle, we have reduced the chance of the fire, reduced the risk. So either we don't have ignition sources next to highly combustible fuels, or we don't have fuels next to ignition sources. It's the same sort of thing, but in reality, one of the basic ways of trying to deal with these issues is actually to separate things out and therefore reduce the potential risk. So when we're looking at sources of ignition, it is important to consider absolutely everything. Now, some heat sources, experience will tell us, aren't necessarily going to be a source of ignition. So, for instance, if you've got a workplace and it's got a traditional water-filled radiator type situation, whilst the radiators may get very hot to the touch, it's highly unlikely that they are going to get hot enough to provide that ignition source to a combustible material. Will depend on the material. Obviously, some liquids will have a much lower point of ignition than perhaps paper and cardboard and things like that. But again, it's looking at where it goes. And sometimes you do have to think totally out of the ballpark. So I've listed there on the slide some of the things that we would expect to identify, and obviously naked flames, hot processes, cooking, hot surfaces, electrics are the things people tend to focus on. Just to pick up on how easy it is for something to occur and not really be recognized is the refracted or focused light. It's several years ago now, but at one stage, as part of our awards to people who were speaking for us or providing a service, we used to give out large glass paperweights in a sort of a globe of the Earth. And we've discovered, fortunately, fairly quickly, that if these are put in direct sunlight, the refracted light through them works very much like a magnifying glass and could focus a heat source actually onto a paper, and actually started papers smouldering in our office. So sometimes it's looking beyond what you might expect, but having an idea of all the potential sources of ignition and then ignoring the ones that aren't actually likely to cause a fire, but focusing on how we can remove the rest from fuels, how we can control things, can we put processes in place, can we look at the sort of heat that's coming off of things like lamps, can we do electrical testing to make sure that we reduce some of these risks down, is fairly critical. The next thing then is to look at the sources of fuel. The modern commercial environment, a lot of the furnishings, the fixtures and fittings, the fabrics we use, the foams within furniture actually mean that as a result they're better than perhaps they used to be, but we still have an awful lot of materials that we use within commercial premises that can end up being a fuel source. And looking at where they're stored, how they're stored, where the ignition sources are, where our first aid firefighting is in relation to these things, and an education process for people using these about how materials are left lying around or how they're stored and secured away is quite critical. So as part of the assessment, you would look at not only the ignition sources but the fuel sources as well. And then in terms of oxygen, as I said, it's very difficult to actually remove the oxygen from our workday situation. But if we have got mechanical ventilation systems, if we've got air handling systems that are moving oxygen around the building, we need to consider what happens to those in a fire type situation. And it's also possible that some of the materials we use, some of the metals that we might have in the building actually will contribute oxygen to the fire above and beyond what we would find in the normal atmosphere. So again, having an understanding of how that might affect what's going on, particularly if we're doing a risk assessment in a workplace where we may have an industrial process going on, is relatively important. And although we're looking at the potential hazard and the potential to cause harm to people, obviously what we have to consider is the risk to those people. So quite often what gets forgotten about is in a commercial premises where a risk assessment is done, people tend to think about the normal day-to-day activity. And a lot of our precautions and a lot of our measures that we put in place to try and deal with things safely rely on a level of occupancy of the building, rely on procedures, things like fire marshals, fire wardens, searching of the premises in the event of a fire alarm, all of those sorts of things. And a lot of that actually changes significantly once we go outside the normal working day and we end up with just isolated contractors or cleaners or somebody working late within the building, where we have a much lower level of occupancy, and perhaps the detection by person of a fire is far less likely to happen. So we need to look at the sort of people who are at risk and the times that we're using the premises. We also need to understand whether those people are familiar with the premises, whether they're our staff, whether we've trained them on what to do in the event of discovering a fire, or whether we've got members of the public, how we deal with visitors to the premises, whether it's just the public or whether it's customers or whether it's actual contractors, and see how we can make that a part of our process, how we can improve their safety. We then have to look at people who are going to need additional assistance to escape in case of a fire, but also in how they may react to a fire, and follow that all the way through. So we're looking at a level of awareness, a level of assistance required, and a level of familiarity so that we can determine who's at risk and how we're actually going to provide a suitably safe environment for all of those people. And then we have to look at what's actually going to happen, how the fire is going to occur. Now, usually, as far as we're concerned when we're looking at fire strategies, we will focus most of our attention on the accidental fire. So something that's happened either because an ignition source is too close to combustible material or something's gone wrong. It could be that part of that is because we haven't maintained our equipment, we're not following an appropriate process, we're not dealing with disposal of rubbish effectively, all of those sorts of bits and pieces. The other side of the aspect that we have to consider is the potential for arson and somebody deliberately setting fire. And although it's very difficult to actually come up with a strategy to prevent arson, there are a number of measures we can put in place to reduce the potential risk. And one of the things to consider when looking at the risk of a fire occurring would be to look at the history of the property, determine what's gone on before, and the profile of the work. And obviously certain types of premises with certain types of relationship with customers or the public may be more prone to an arson attack than others. So it is down to practical bits and pieces, and obviously sometimes security can offset the risk of potential arson. Sometimes we have to put in physical measures to try and reduce the potential risks, so things like additional detection, things like suppression systems, to try and compensate for how our fire is likely to occur. So it's a good idea at the outset to talk to the premises owners, get their history in terms of fire and fire-related activity so that we can understand what's likely to happen in the future. Okay, and then what we're generally doing then in terms of the fire risk assessment is a fairly structured approach to going through. So go through the premises, identify the hazards, look at the current level of risk, and then for each of those levels of risk, what we're trying to do is reduce it down. So look at the existing proportions and then decide the precautions, and then decide if we need to put additional measures in place. Now, in doing a fire risk assessment, a lot of people may start with a sort of a matrix approach. So you look at a particular hazard, you look at the likelihood of that hazard causing a risk, and you look at the potential severity should that occur. And obviously the highest priority is to take the items that have a high likelihood and a high severity and try and put in additional measures to try and reduce those down, either to reduce the likelihood of it occurring or to reduce the potential severity should something go wrong. But the first step has to be identify what the level of risk is and what the existing precautions are, and then we can start looking at putting in other measures to reduce the risk or to mitigate some of the potential consequences. So I mentioned earlier on why we might look to do a fire risk assessment. And in the first instance, the main purpose of the assessment is to establish exactly what the baseline condition is and establish what's being done, how safe is the situation, how have we coped with the existing risks. And it might just be that what we're then looking to do is to see what do we have to do just to maintain that standard, and that might be from a management perspective just carry on doing what you're doing. It might need some additional training, might need some additional processes, but obviously it could mean some additional active or fire or passive fire protection measures. What's critical though is that the assessment is done every time there's a significant change in circumstances, a change in use, a change in process, because all of those things will have a knock-on effect on the safety. And so I mentioned right at the beginning that the fire risk assessment is not the same as the standard we would use for design. But it is important that somebody coming in and operating a premises has an understanding of the design principles for the premises and all of the assumptions that went into that design, so that they can effectively understand the implications of changing anything in the way in which they operate the premises or processes that they carry out. And ultimately, this process fails totally if we don't actually feed back to the responsible person for the premises and enable them to make the changes and give timescales and guidance on how that should be done. So that's what we'll try and do. As we go through doing the risk assessment, as I say, it's not a building regulation compliance issue. It's looking at fire safety management, and good management can incorporate measures that will reduce the likelihood of fire. It is down to things like general housekeeping as well as actual control of maybe more hazardous processes. But it needs to be done on a premises in use. A lot of people talk to me about having a fire risk assessment in place at design stage to help inform that design, help the designer, help those checking the design to make sure the fire strategy is placed. To be honest, at that stage it's not really a fire risk assessment, because if it is, it's still making a huge number of assumptions about how the premises are actually going to run. What it is at that stage is a sort of a fire strategy statement. And yes, that can be used to inform the design, but the assessment can only really be done once the premises is up and running and in use. So the question is, I suppose, who's going to do this fire risk assessment for us? And, you know, is it something we can attempt to do ourselves? Well, certainly in England there's a requirement for the fire risk assessment, and it needs to be done to determine the risk from fire. The responsibility is placed on the person in control of the premises, and there's no specific legal requirement for the person doing the fire risk assessment to have a specific qualification. What is needed is an understanding of the issues and a competence to do it. Now, for simple premises, it is suggested that perhaps the duty holder, the person responsible for the premises, could do the fire risk assessment with a bit of guidance, and there is a lot of guidance online available from government departments and the like to actually give the concept of how to do the fire risk assessment. But I think the important thing there is that if, as a premises owner, they have no real experience of fire other than what they read in guidance, there's an element of they don't necessarily understand the issues, and if we're not careful, that sort of fire risk assessment becomes a sort of a simplistic tick box type approach. So there is this legal responsibility that the organisation or the staff or the person with responsibility for the premises ensures that a risk assessment is carried out and that the precautions are adequate, and within that there's an implication that whoever's doing this is competent to do so. Now, I mentioned briefly just now that there are qualifications that people can have, and obviously when risk assessments came in as a normal way of doing things, there are a number of bodies doing qualifications, and that has dwindled somewhat because the people now practicing and providing fire risk assessments tend to be of a level where they have other qualifications alongside it, and the concept of just being able to do a qualification purely in fire risk assessment to make you competent is perhaps a little bit dubious. But also there's other guidance out there available, and particularly the publicly available specification published by BSI in terms of a methodology. But a lot of the guidance is about the process to go through rather than the fundamental detail of what to expect and how to understand the risk. So it is about competence and it is about understanding. And if people are looking to offer a service as a fire risk assessor, they need to be able to demonstrate to the person responsible for the premises that they are competent to do so. So it needs a good understanding of the legislation that pushes the fire risk assessment. It needs a sound, if you like, education, training, knowledge, skills, experience in the sector. An understanding of how fires behave and how they're going to grow, an understanding of how to do a methodical fire risk assessment, and critically, you know, this concept of being able to identify the potential hazards that could then potentially lead to a risk to the occupants. So in offering the service, the client needs to be relatively reassured that you are competent to do so. And in basic terms, some of the things you have to start looking at then are what's the legislation. And I notice there's a question come in saying, do you know if it's a legal obligation in Scotland to carry out fire risk assessment in general needs communal areas in flats? I mean, obviously, generally in terms of the legislation, there's a lot of debate about particularly flats because within the scope of legislation, the flat is covered by the Regulatory Reform Order in England and legislation elsewhere, and as a result there is a need to do a fire risk assessment on those sort of common areas in some sort of control. The question is who's responsible for those areas. It could be a landlord, it could be a managing agent, it could be a residents association. And increasingly people are saying, well, how can I effectively do a risk assessment of the common parts of something like a block of flats if I don't know what's going on the other side of that fire door? So the flat entrance door, if somebody's put, you know, a motorbike in their flat hallway, it's potentially going to have a knock-on effect. Although we've got a degree of protection by the fire door itself, there is an argument that you can't effectively control the risk in the common area if you don't know what's going on behind the fire doors. So understanding the base legislation, where it's coming from, is important, but obviously a lot of people may choose to have a fire risk assessment that goes over and above the basic requirements. So it might look at things like property protection, might look at things like business continuity. So we shouldn't necessarily just think about what is the minimum sort of standard we're going to try and hit. It needs to be something that's appropriate to the premises and realistic, and something like flats are a particular problem because there may not be a day-to-day presence to actually manage the fire safety in flats. So if there's a process there, but then the tenants decide that they're going to start putting something into the hallway or the staircase enclosures or something, that sort, it's far more difficult to manage if there isn't a presence there on site. And then the fire risk assessor needs to understand how the fire is going to develop, what can cause the fire, look at things like means of escape, look at fire prevention, protection measures that we can put in, and again consider what is appropriate in terms of fire safety management and planning. So I've touched on looking at the risk, and it's very difficult to actually say exactly what do I have to look at. You can't really give somebody a checklist and say go away and work to this. You have to have the ability to be able to look at a building, look at a premises, look what's going on, and identify where the potential hazards are. And that is the trick. Having identified the hazard, then actually equating that to what's the potential harm, what's the potential likelihood, therefore what's the risk, is relatively easy. The tricky bit is identifying the hazards in the first place. And there will be some hazards that apply across the board, and there will be some that will be very specific to whatever's going on in that particular premises. And pretty much everybody would identify now that electrical appliances could be a hazard, and the normal mitigating measure that is put in place is, well, let's get them tested on a regular basis to make sure that the appliance is at least electrically sound. That doesn't guarantee it's not going to catch fire in the first place, but it's probably as much as we can do to try and mitigate some of that risk in the meantime. And what we're trying to look at will involve a whole load of issues, and it will deal with all aspects of the fire. It will look at things like occupancy. I'm very conscious that down on the sort of bottom right hand side of that it talks about fire service access. I have seen fire risk assessments that base the strategy on what's actually likely to happen, when the fire service are likely to arrive, how quickly is that going to happen. And in reality you can't rely on that, because even if you happen to have a premises that's next door to the local fire station, there's the possibility they're going to be out on another call somewhere else, and there may be a more delayed attendance. So it's really looking at what we're going to do, how we're going to manage it ourselves internally in terms of management responsibility, rather than maybe what somebody else might do, like the fire service, as and when they turn up to help us post-incident, if you like, or during the incident. So loads of things to try and consider, and this is why it needs somebody with a decent set of skills and understanding of how fire works to be able to carry out this process. So within some of the guidance, some guidance talks about a 5-step approach, some guidance talks about a 9-step approach. The general sort of principle is you follow what we've been talking about. You identify the hazards. If it is a trivial hazard, if it's not likely to happen, if it's not likely to cause a risk, if it's not likely to actually cause an injury, then ignore it. Don't bog down the fire risk assessment with a lot of detail that is never going to actually have an impact upon anybody. So evaluate the hazard, then look at who might be harmed, then look at the controls, and then it's absolutely fundamental to record the findings of a fire risk assessment. Now, relatively small premises with very limited numbers of people employed, a risk assessment needs to be done, but it's suggested in some of the guidance that you don't have to record it. I would suggest, if you don't record the findings, how can you ever identify that you've actually done a risk assessment? So in reality, you've always got to record it, and the critical part of the recording is to identify what else needs to be done. And I suppose the difficult bit is then to prioritize those items and put timescales to them. Because if you've identified something that is potentially a residual risk, in reality, if there is a risk there, it more or less is always going to need addressing fairly quickly. But quite often the client will have resource issues in terms of how quickly they can actually deal with that. And then this isn't do a risk assessment and then walk away from it, job done. It has to be reviewed, it has to be revised. Every time something changes, every time there's a change to the way we use the premises, the way we manage the premises, or at least periodically as well, we should review the risk assessment, revise it, and go through the process again. So I've got some slides here to sort of indicate some of the things that might be looked at and how we might identify some of the potential hazards. Things like electrical faults and what we might start to look at in terms of controls, sort of periodic testing, restricting appliances being brought in from outside, limiting trading leads and things like that. Practical bits and pieces that we would then sort of try to follow through. But I'm not suggesting this is a comprehensive guide. This is a sort of an indication of what you might look at and what you might consider to do. And it does basic things like security and arson and making sure that we don't have large fire loads next to the premises. So simple things like keeping the refuge bins remote from the building perimeter so that it's not an easily ignitable source of fuel that's in close proximity to the actual structure itself. And so you would carry on and go through the building in this sort of process, identifying some of the hazards, looking to see what's there. A lot of it is going to be about using suitable material, suitable equipment, maintaining it. So simple sort of things might be if you come across a lot of the old 3-bar electrical fire or the modern halogen heaters. Again, they can be a high risk if they're in close proximity to combustible materials. So it might just be a blanket ban on using that type of installation and process. And looking at how you can offset some of these things in terms of risk assessment. And I quite often get asked by people, oh, I've had a risk assessment done, do you think this is suitable, do you think it's the right approach? I had somebody approach me not so long back saying, oh, we've had a company do a fire risk assessment of our school, and we're not really sure about what they put in the report. And it was very much one of these things where I think they were trying to fit the premises into a mould. So it identified in the fire risk assessment that although the school had first aid firefighting, it had extinguishers around the premises, the school had adopted what they were calling a flight, not fight approach. So even in relation to relatively small fires, staff have been trained that in the event of a fire, it was important to get out and not to attempt to tackle the fire in terms of firefighting equipment. And that had been identified in the fire risk assessment, and as a strategy for protecting the pupils and the staff in the particular school, that probably was a way to go. It probably wasn't particularly popular with the insurers, because obviously even relatively small fires, if they're going to be left, are potentially going to develop. What the school were querying in the fire risk assessment is, having identified that as the management process, if you like, and accepted that it was suitable for the conditions, in the report and the recommendation part of the fire risk assessment, there was a recommendation that the school provided 6 or 7 additional fire extinguishers. Yet if their strategy was we're never going to use them, there was very little point in actually recommending something else. So although we have to identify the hazards and look at the measures that can be put in place to reduce the potential risk, that has to be a process of, once the report is produced, discussing and reviewing that with the management, with the person in control of the premises, to actually see what they physically can or can't do and what they're actually going to adopt. And a lot of the fire risk assessment at that stage is an education process in explaining to the person responsible for the premises why they need to do things and the importance of doing things in a certain way. And then once we've run through and done our assessment of the potential hazards and worked at what might go wrong and what potentially needs to be addressed, then realistically we're actually looking at putting right what isn't right and what isn't there and what's not correct. So it is about prioritizing and rectifying any of those deficiencies. And again, within that, what has to be done is to look at that matrix of likelihood and severity. And if something is highly likely and highly severe in its consequences, it needs to be a very urgent priority in terms of rectifying the deficiencies and getting the situation back to something that's safe. And quite often the fire risk assessor has a significant dilemma here, because if they find something that is so fundamentally bad in the operation and running and management of the premises that people are at imminent risk within there, the question is, do they then report that to the enforcing authority, or do they work with the management to try and get it back? And this is where the responsible fire risk assessor has to take a view and say, well, I've done this report, I've prepared a schedule of what needs to be done to put it right. At what point do I then walk away? Do I go back and say I want to see these things in operation in a few months' time, or actually is my contract ended, I've done the risk assessment, I've fulfilled my role, and actually how they then respond to my report is entirely up to the client? And that's always going to be a sort of a professional dilemma. And then obviously once those things have been rectified, it would be ideal to get the assessment revisited to show that it's cleared and those actions have been taken. But the difficult bit becomes when there's something that's a middle sort of a potential risk, and it's therefore not as high priority as some issues, but it needs to be done. And then the issue is there. If you say, well, you need to do this within the next 6 months, the counter-argument is, well, if it could wait 6 months, why can't it wait a year? And how have we actually managed to conclude that 6 months is a reasonable period of time? What happens then if something happens in 3-4 months after we've done the fire risk assessment? So it is always going to be difficult. It is going to require professional judgment, but the premises owner, the premise occupier, is normally going to need a degree of advice unless it's a very small, very simplistic premises. Okay, right. I'm now looking to see if we've got any further questions. I noticed that a couple of you have had some issues with the sound, and hopefully Katie's managed to sort those out for you. There was a question about the flats, which we've sort of touched on as we've gone through. Otherwise, has anybody else got any more questions in relation to this subject? Okay, right. It's just starting to pick up some of these bits and pieces. Just wait while I drive my mouse around the screen so I can pick up the visits. Sounds like visiting the premises at various times of the day to see how occupants interact would be sensible. It possibly can't be done in one visit. I think there is an element of, if you have a premises that changes in its use during the day, and any commercial premises will in terms of the profile of people that are there, it's not necessarily 100% important to visit at different times, but it is important to have a good understanding of what goes on. And I think, as I say, you know, if you take an office building, it's what happens at night when maybe there's only a security person on, or whether the cleaner's in on their own, and how do we address that? If you look at something like retail, if it's outside shop hours and we've got people in warehouse or back of house in stock rooms, it's not only important about, you know, the level of awareness and whether they know whether something's going on in unoccupied areas, but it's also what sort of level of training of those people had. A lot of workplaces will do regular training of their staff, will do practice evacuations, and all the sort of things that in terms of a record of what's going on you'd expect to see when you do the risk assessment. But do they actually train the cleaners who only turn up at the premises in the middle of the evening or first thing in the morning? And do they have an understanding of what needs to be done and how they can get out of the premises? And, you know, if it's a commercial premises and it hasn't got a lot of detection, it relies on the staff break glass points to alert everybody else in the building. Is that strategy still viable when there's only 1 or 2 people on the premises? So I think it does need to encompass the whole issue and to look at all of the use all of the time. Okay, would a management flat over a pub need to be covered by a fire risk assessment? Does the RRO apply to this? In essence, the actual living accommodation, because nobody's employed whilst they're in it, or although it may be an employee that's occupying it, in practice in the flat isn't covered, but because it's all within one building, and particularly within something like a management flat in a pub, the flat probably hasn't got the same level of separation between the living accommodation and the commercial use that you would find in a block of flats where each block of flat is its own compartment in effect. I would suggest that you would extend the risk assessment to the living accommodation, not so much in terms of what risk does the living accommodation pose to the pub, but what risk are the people in that particular living accommodation at should something occur in the commercial use outside of normal operating hours. And who's required to read or understand the fire risk assessment once it's implemented? Well, ultimately the fire risk assessment is there for the use of the person who is responsible in law for the building. So the person who's managing, the person who's occupying, the owner of the premises. And therefore the terminology needs to be such that the person who is there and running the building and who actually is carrying out the day-to-day activity can understand what's being sent. So a lot of technical language probably isn't appropriate. And bear in mind that the risk assessment in part, when it comes down to things like staff training and operation, is going to be probably shared with everybody to let them understand what's going on. So it needs to be tailored in its language so that it's understandable by the layperson who doesn't understand fire matters. Because ultimately, if they had that language and they had that understanding, they wouldn't have asked you to do the risk assessment. So you need to put it in the terms that they're able to understand. Okay, next question. If travel distances are exceeded in a care home, if only by a metre or so, should additional fire doors be recommended, or could alternatives be considered such as smoke detectors, fire suppression, etc.? Residential care is always very difficult because obviously there's a degree of residential care where the people within the premises are going to need assistance to get out. Evacuation in a fire, should a fire get to that stage, is going to take longer, is going to be more intensive in terms of staff assisting people. Training is going to be critical. If something varies from what we see in written guidance, it's always sensible in the first instance to take a step back and say, well, what's the principle of the guidance? Why is it there? What's it trying to achieve? And normally when it's things like travel distances or distances we have to move people, what we're actually looking at is the time that it takes to get out. And the distance that goes into a lot of standards is actually a reflection of the time it takes to get people out of the premises. Now in a care home, it's going to take longer anyway, because we're trying to assist people. People are not as mobile, perhaps they're more elderly or whatever, so they may take longer to escape. So from a practical point of view, either you've got to see some evidence that there's a management process or a staffing level that compensates for that extra time that it's going to take, or you're going to look for something else to offset it. And as you've suggested in the question, something like detectors, which perhaps will make people aware of a fire more quickly and get them moving more quickly, or fire suppression, which will reduce the initial development of the fire, may be something that you can use to compensate for that potential delay or that potential additional time that you need to look at. But you have to make the judgment call very much based upon what you presented with, and it could well be that a management procedure or something else could also help to assist in some of these issues. Right, where are we? Next question. As a client, when a retirement court has been incorrectly designated as a care home, what additional recommendations should we actually take on board? So I think the issue is here, if something is if you like, sheltered housing as opposed to a care home or something of that sort, what you're doing with the risk assessment is you are looking at how the premises is being used and the actual people involved. So to a certain extent, what label's been thrown at it is almost irrelevant, because the risk assessment is looking at the actual conditions and the actual way in which the premises is managed, and that's how the assessment is being done. The design legislation and the design standard is a different issue. Now, if you assess something as a retirement premises and it becomes more of a care home, then there's an issue with, if you like, the ongoing change and the impact that has. The fundamental difference is that something that may be, if you like, sheltered housing or retirement type accommodation can be very akin to flats, in which case the risk assessment may only look at the sort of procedures for the common areas. The difficulty is if it becomes semi-care home where some of the people in the flats or the accommodation need additional support and care, or as it's sort of in that transition stage where then, yes, you would be looking at what's going on in the individual units of accommodation. So it doesn't necessarily matter what label's on it. What you have to look at is the circumstances that are presented to you and how it's really being used and managed. Does the assessment need to be made available or displayed for building users, e.g. office staff, probably visitors or anything like that? There's a legal obligation to have a risk assessment. It doesn't have to be on public display, but quite often it makes sense for the management of a building to at least share it with the staff so that everybody has a buy-in and an understanding of what the issues are and how they're being managed. So that everybody really understands the implications of their actions or how they go about their business. In terms of a public building, do we need to have to make it available? No, we don't. Ultimately, it's for the management to make sure that the public would then be safe within the premises. Okay, I think that's probably picked up on all the questions I've got come through at the moment, unless you've spotted anything else, Katie.
No, as far as I can see, Kevin, everything's been covered off. And just picking up on what you said, those people that did have a few sound issues, I know that sound was dropping in and out for a couple of people. It all seemed okay our end, but it could just come down to bandwidth. But ultimately, we are recording this session, so if anybody has missed any content that they obviously is important, then this will be available on our YouTube channel. Give me a couple of hours and I'll get it all uploaded, so you can catch up or share it with any colleagues once, like I say, once it's available online.
Yeah, Katie, just picking up on that, and something perhaps I should have said in previous webinars, if you are actually watching this webinar as a recording rather than live and you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with myself or anybody here on the technical side, and we will then address those questions as they come forward. So if you're watching this as a recording, go onto our website, use our contact us, and get in touch with us, ask the question, and we'll come back to you and try and give you an answer to anything that occurs if you're watching this as a recording.
Kevin, a question just has popped up now. I didn't know if you just wanted to quickly catch that before we sign off.
Okay, just a very last question then. Is there future scope to amend the criteria in approved document Q to assist in reducing risks from vandalism and fire? Document Q is about security and at the moment is very much restricted to dwellings. And no, there's nothing actually on the agenda to look at the sort of vandalism or arson issue in relation to that. It's always a problem because most of our design strategy is based upon looking at accidental type fires. I suppose the additional guidance that we tend to get at the moment in relation to dealing with things like arson actually is part of the overall security that you won't necessarily find in the guidance documents to the building regulations, but you do find in the publicly secured by design publications that are put out by the police authorities in terms of general advice in relation to security, which do cover some sort of arson issues as well, and they apply across the board to domestic and commercial premises.
And if I may follow on from that, Kevin, it's perhaps a good moment to say that our webinar in July, on the 12th of July, we are actually looking at designing to minimise the risk of arson. So obviously with the fire theme today, maybe that is something that people would look to sign up for. The details obviously are on our website if you want to join us for our webinar that day, where we're looking more at that sort of element.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'll just leave you to sum up then, Katie.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So again, thank you for your time this morning, Kevin, and your expertise. Once again, I hope everybody's found it enjoyable, worthwhile, and obviously, getting something out of the content that we're delivering. We're next going to be online on Wednesday, the 19th of April, and what we're looking at next time will be the principles of designing for sound insulation in dwellings. So again, feel free to pop onto our website, cbld.com/webinars, where you can sign up. And then going forward, we're looking at May in cavity walls, and in June we're looking at safety in outdoor events. So if there's anything there that interests you, maybe interests colleagues, please feel free to sign up, share, tell everybody what we're online and what we're discussing. And we will see you again soon. So as I say, thank you for joining us. Have a great rest of the day, and any questions, feel free to get in touch. Thank you.